record. And now I'm going to mute myself and pass it over. Thank you, Dr. Deargon.
Thank you so much. I really want to say thank you to you, Caroline, Rhonda, and you, Allison, for this invitation. It's been a while since I spoke English in a presentation like this, so I might need help at times. And I want to obviously acknowledge that I am talking to you from the island of Montreal, which is Mohawk territory. And I want to honor ancestors from those territories, Métis or First Nations, where this might end up, might be listened to. So it's a real privilege, a real honor to be here and sharing those experiences. Yes? Okay. So it's true. I've been working, learning, healing and all my life, and I think I'm gonna need an extra life to go on. But my life really drastically changed when I connected with my own Indigenous origins, and it's and since then my life has really been more meaningful. And this had been kept secret in my family, so we never knew about our grandparents. And even if my grandmother had raised my mom, something happened and it made it such a secret. And God gave us a lot of work, my brothers and my sisters and I, to figure out where we came from. So I'm going to go through a few slides. I'm going to read to contextualize the work the work I'm going to be sharing with you. And again, if you have any question of course this is recorded, but if you have any questions, just to clarify one point and or question on the approach. This approach I've been using in different contexts because this was my way that was, let's say, accessible to me with who I am and culture and all that. But after being introduced to Indigenous knowledge, I feel very humble by everything I learned, and that without a diploma, a degree, or the kind of learning journey that we have on the other side. I remember I was adopted by an elder, a grandmother, adopted as an adult, and she had been in the first part of her life a midwife, traditional midwife, of course, but leaving with families out in the bush for months, so she could be there for them. And I remember asking her about transmission of trauma, what that meant for her, and she answered that when they realized that a mother or father or a family was being wounded at the time where a child might be born, the community and women in the community would take the child for a while and would make sure that the parents would be healed and ready, so they would prevent that way a transmission of trauma in our own terms. But isn't it humbling when we barely start talking about transmission of trauma and to really get into it? And I have so many examples where elders, even without knowing me sometimes, I remember an elder in ceremony in Sudbury. I was attending that ceremony, and he came to me, he had a cane, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I told him I'm here to pray and I'm here to learn, and it's an honor for me. And he pushed me with his cane and told me, you're ready to start helping us. Go ahead and start. And it really, I guess, gave me, or the motivation I had, or strengthened the motivation I had to start being a helper. We don't have that much time, so I'll read few slides to contextualize, and then I'll go with sharing examples of intervention with families struggling with suicide or grieving or trying to prevent another loss. And so with a journey back in time, and quite often realize that these families had lost children to residential schools or hospitals or never came back. So that's why I was happy, because of the context we're in right now, to come up and share what's been there for a while, and the work you've been doing. So I'll start reading the first slide. This presentation looks at few situations where families touched by suicide today, while having lost a family member through an institution like hospital, residential school, or because of no access to justice. Situations where families were often left uninformed and powerless. The acknowledgement of their loss usually denied, and the context to allow grieving stolen from them. So I heard, of course, things like, our baby was never brought back from the hospital. Our two uncles never made it back from residential school. Or the police told us it was an accident, but we always knew it wasn't. So we'll go to the next slide. Intergenerational transmission of trauma. The effects of unresolved trauma can be carried across generations through different pathways: psychological, developmental, relational, physiological, genetic, epigenetic, brain development, social, poverty, exclusion, no access to justice or education. Of course, it's only part of the complexity of that whole reality. This short presentation will concentrate on the psychological level, with a focus on how individual development, conjugal relationships, and family dynamics can be burdened by the consequences of unresolved traumatic losses in prior generations, and sometimes bring destructive or self-destructive behaviors, including suicide. Next slide. Traumatic losses left unresolved generate a number of destructive and self-destructive strategies, usually allowing the immediate survival of the family, but also creating the ground for repetition scenarios, more or less like new versions of the original loss, in the younger family members or in the following generations. One child can grow up identified to the perpetrator or to the victim. A newborn can be identified as replacing the family member that was lost. The violence that came from outside is internalized, transforming the family relationships as new battleground. The integrity of the life and identity of the family members becomes threatened. Of course, I know you know all these things, but it's just contextualizing our time together. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to use some genograms of families I've been working with. And just for those who are not familiar with genograms, if any, so the figures we use to way up there, there's a little square and little circle. So square is for males and circle for females, daughters, grandmothers, mothers. Right beside, there's the image of a square and the circle at the other end, and underneath them, a girl and a boy. So it represents a family with the girl who's the first one, older one, and the boy, second one, and younger one. And looking at that image a little more complicated, just to get more familiar. At the bottom of that first line, we have a line with a girl, a boy, and another girl. And then we have on one side the blue square, which is their father, and the red circle, which is mom. So we also have the family origin of the father on his side, the father being the third child after a brother and a sister, and so on. We have his father, and then we have family of origin of his mom, and same on the other side. So it's a very short introduction, but it's complex when we get into family histories, and this tool is quite useful. Okay. Before getting into the first example, I'm always worried about how pertinent this way of learning and understanding and healing might be appropriate. I'm just sharing here briefly that I've been doing sort of cross-cultural work in a number of places where elders were participating to this, and for part of the day, let's say I was involved in a project with Healing Foundation at one point for a number of years. So we would bring parents who were all grieving from suicide, having lost a child or more than one. And we would gather on traditional territories and then stay there for a while. So in the day, we would rebuild their family memories and the community memory together. And there's a lot of sharing, and these places where I've done this is where people were highly spiritual people, I would say. So even using that, let's say, white tool, we ended up sometimes seeing so many things and seeing surprising things, even on these genograms, like ball of fires surrounding one person represented there. And every evening we would go for a sweat. So our the knowledge, the ways of healing, the wisdom took care, I think, pretty well. And after a while, people got more and more reconnected to their own culture because they've been under for so many years under the ruling of religious beliefs. So I just want to say that for me, this is something that can be sort of a bridge or a transition, helping people walk back to their culture. So in this first genogram, it's the person I worked with there was sort of Métis environment, and Lower St. Lawrence River, probably Maliseet, but clearly not acknowledged Métis Nation, of course, and so I received. My client was the red square down there. So I received him after he attempted suicide. He really wanted to die, but he It was January, he went out, and when he shot himself, he slipped, and finally he armed one of his legs seriously. So he was in a hospital for a while, but when he was ready to come out of the hospital, he was referred to me, and for a while it was really challenging. But he taught me so much. That's why I bring him back, because every let's say 24th every month, he really wanted to do it again. We had to hospitalize him around that date every month. Because the level of risk was so powerful. So, but at one point he told me, I'm tired. I won't harm myself, but I don't want to go back to the hospital. I just want to work with you and trying to figure out things together. So I didn't understand, especially why a specific date every month, and what could we learn from that? I had not heard from generational transmission of trauma. Then he really introduced me just by being who he was. So I asked him to, knowing that he was very close to his mom. So if we follow the green lines up to his mom, and not distant from his father, the dots are that's what they're about. So he had two sisters and one brother older than him, but he was quite younger, and really became very close to his mom. So I asked him, why don't you ask your mom? Maybe we could understand something, or because it was such a challenge to make any sense from his reality. So he said, no, I can't ask her because she, every time I ask something about, herself or her family, she always starts crying and gets really sad and stay away from me. So I learned not to ask her any questions. So I asked him, who else? And well, he said, my mom has a younger sister. She lives in the city, so maybe I could contact her. And then he called her, and she just told him, go in the cemetery and look for my father's burial place. He never did that, and because the secret that the mom was keeping around where she came from didn't allow him to even do that. He drank a lot. He was a very dangerous driver. And again, without realizing, he had separated from his wife, mother of his 3 sons there, in the year before he attempted suicide. And also he was pretty sure that his oldest son would die shortly after him. So we went to the cemetery. He wanted me there with him to realize that his grandfather had died at the exact age he had when he attempted suicide, which is like 42 years old, and the 24th of January. And he was stunned to realize that he had done something without understanding why that time, why so strongly pushed to do it and redo it and try again. But after he realized the connection, like exactly the same age and dying exactly the same day that took his grandfather away, he just now having that information, that food for his brain, I guess, he stopped thinking about suicide. that there was a big change, just bringing some truth and some facts. And so like he was not vulnerable as much as before to that transgenerational pressure that made him want to go on the same day at the same age. So he went back to his mom and he said, "Mom, I know now that, I know now where my grandfather is buried, and I know the age he had when he died. I want to know more." And he kind of pushed his mom, and she started to cry forever, he said, cry like a baby. And then the mom opened up to share that story that she had knowingly or not knowingly transferred into him with so much intensity. So his mother finally told him, explained to him that her father died in an accident. He was drunk and he killed someone. And that, all that, so much shame on the family. And that's why the younger sister left. And she also told me that her older sister was so very close to their father. People would say that she was closer to the father than the mother was. And some even talked about incest between them. So that oldest sister committed suicide a month after her father died in that accident. And of course, there was more shame and more misunderstanding. But when he heard that, he understood that his own thinking that his oldest son would die after he would have committed suicide. Just we see the repeating, the terrible pressure through repetition here. So the more he learned about his grandfather, because he had more in common with him, the way he would drive drunk, the way like he people would say he's gonna kill someone, like his, people would talk about it, but the family was, of course, under shame, under silence, so he asked more to his mom to tell me more. I want to know why my grandfather acted this way. So his mom told him that her father, when he was a baby, 2-3 years old, his parents were walking. They were, of course, living in the country, and they were walking on the side of the road, and then a car came and hit the mom right beside. He was in his father's arms, and so right beside him and his father, the mom was killed in that accident. And then the father recognized the village's doctor driving with someone else's wife inside that car. So, of course, the father tried to get justice, tried to get repair, acknowledgement. And then police didn't help him at all. And then the priest told him, well, we all need that doctor with us. So don't try to forgive and forget what happened. So, of course, now we were getting closer to how it started. But of course, no no healing was possible. Of course, the grieving was not acknowledged. And then the family sort of closed. Sorry, can't find the word here. But anyway, they were prisoner of that terrible traumatic loss, again, with no acknowledgement, no justice, and no help. So that started, these are the ingredients to start that process of transgenerational or intergenerational transmission of trauma. So even as a child, what I thought when I heard about him, the grandfather, and his first daughter, he was 2, 3 years old when he lost his mom in that tragic accident. But his 2, 3-year-old boy grief was never acknowledged because the whole family was in darkness. So my thought was that he reproduced the relationship that he lost from losing his mom with his first daughter. And that's why they had their own bubble. And that's why it felt incestuous, because that level of closeness. I don't know if was more. So gives you an idea how a chain reaction of transmission of trauma can start. Those ingredients were there, like in so many other situations, and some few more we're going to look at. After he found out, after his mom cried, after he learned more about what happened, he saw how much he was impersonating, I don't know if it's the right word, but how much his own personality had been built as following her grandfather's image, like the driving, and of course, the suicide attempt on the same day the grandfather died. So he taught me so much. I didn't know that was possible. I was scratching my head at first. How can this be so powerful without us, and without people not understanding before? And he was pointed at as a drunk driver and wanting to kill someone, and of course he had the grief of his grandfather, a young baby, 2, 3-year-old, who lost his mom. But I think he really had the anger that the grandfather picked up from his own father, great-grandfather, and from the whole family, and that it was kept secret, it was kept closed. So that's why he eventually carried so much of that unresolved situation. He transformed himself. We did a very, very different journey after that in psychotherapy for a while. He became a champion and very active in his community to help people, stay away from alcohol, or bring the positive side. So that I learned so much from him, and the trust he gave me. So yeah, that's my one of my teachers. So I don't know if any of you would have comments or questions at this point before we go to the next one. I'm sorry, it's heavy stuff. You're having a light lunch, but you're not having a light presentation, I guess. But it's good to remember ourselves that this is to protect life and to learn more, to be able to strengthen and protect life even more strongly. So if there's no question, We can go to the other one. Thank you. Another tough situation that I'm going to share with you, but again, through that intervention and that process, there's light, showing up, and that keeps me motivated. It's hard work when you go that deep and go that way. I remember doing some work in way up north in a community really wounded, and in this community we had many homicides and many suicides. And me and a couple of my crazy Inuit colleagues, we started to visit families of families where there had been suicide, but also the other families where a family member had committed homicide. And we learned so much. I won't get into that example because it's too complicated and too long. But we learned so much there too. And yes, so look at this second example together. My first clients in the lower part of the diagram, my first clients were a couple. We can see him, the square, and her, the circle, and their children, 2 boys and the girl at the bottom. They asked for help. They were desperate. They had recently lost their first son to suicide. And second, and let's say the couple does not exist anymore. The family did not exist anymore. The father blamed himself so much. Father was a police officer, and the family left for go shopping in a city nearby, and the oldest son stayed home, asked to stay home. He didn't want to follow. And the father had forgotten to lock the rifle cabinet. So his son used one of his firearms. So the father blamed himself and was thinking himself about suicide. And the couple was not a couple anymore. They were not together at all. So that was pretty tough request to receive. And as usual, I start asking questions. Just looking at my watch. Whoa, time flies. I started to ask questions where they came from and how they understood their son's suicide. And he told me they were worried because their second son now was talking about suicide. He spent the whole days in his brother's room and listening to his music, playing his guitar, and they were really scared for him. So with our regular generational work, what we found out is that the mother was very sort of under her own mother's control, and that the father thought his mother-in-law was kind of related to what happened with his son, and every time he would open up to talk about her, his wife was getting really angry and would protect her mom. I'll summarize. The mother had a brother younger brother who lived alone now with the mother, and who was really, really addicted. And everybody saw him as abusing his mom for money and, the bad guy. And the mom didn't want to do anything about it. So asking for more, the grandmother never came, but asking the father and the mom tried to question um, the mother's mother, the grandmother, about what happened in her life, her younger life, and to find out that uh, in her family, the grandmother, two younger brothers that she raised because her own mother died at a young age. She had raised those two little squares and when they never came back from residential school, neither of them. So of course we have there another impossible to heal or to grieve loss, as we all know. And she became, in her never resolvable grief, she became so rageful that she had never been close to her own daughter, because she had lost those two boys, and she was even jealous that her own daughter had two boys. And it's like her daughter kind of offered her the oldest boy because of her grief. But she was so ragefully grieving that the father said she would eat him up, like she had no limits. She wanted him to herself, and it was very painful for the father to watch, but he had no control on his wife's mother's behavior. And the mother saw also her own mother sort of totally submitted to that younger brother, addicted. And the mother was also totally caught in that really dark pattern that started with the loss of those two brothers in the prior generation. It's a bit complicated. I hope it's possible to follow this. When the father, through our conversations and through going back and making, trying to make the situation understandable, not blaming the grandmother, because the real blame was somewhere else, whoever kept those two boys away forever. But the father, through our conversations, the father got more and more understanding that he shouldn't only blame himself for having forgotten to lock that firearms cabinet, but that there was more to the loss of his son, and that his own wife now was trying to convince the second son to go to his grandmother and sort of replace the role that his older brother would play for her. So the father, which dotted lines are talking about distance in the relationship. So the father, who was never close to his own father, was withdrawn and was not very assertive in the family. His his own father, when he was born, his own father had recently lost the grandfather. So his own father was grieving and he was not ready to adopt him in a way. And it stayed like that. So he didn't know what fatherhood was, and he didn't know how to assert himself. But when he understood that all this came from ones who never came back, those two boys, and that he could relate to the behavior of his mother-in-law, but also his wife, to those first losses. I remember at one point he stood up and he got very, very in a powerful way, and he sort of said, "I won't let this go on." And since then, he actively controlled or built up a boundary between his mother-in-law and their little family. And he made sure that his second son would not be brought to the grandmother by his wife, who was totally still under her own mother's emotional grip, let's say. So the positive aspect of this intervention, I think, is that the father who felt him powerless before, and he didn't find himself that energy to protect his family, understanding things differently and without even blaming his mother-in-law for the double loss that, you know, residential schools caused there. So it brought a certain level of peace in the family, but it gave him the strength to protect life because of that understanding, and because understanding that he was really not the one to blame, and that he was now totally devoted to protect life with boundaries in his family. So it's complicated to explain. Normally I'm standing around and I show this part of but I hope it's understandable in some way. So again, if there's any question, be happy to answer. Hi, Caroline. Can't hear you.
There, I think I've got it. So what stands out for me, if we take this is a clinical context and a community context, where there's like in this a great deal of time, right? And communication between yourself and the family and between the family members. And, as I look at the research that we do on trauma, and the ways in which our funding flows and the demands on students and the demands on researchers who are more senior to collect data and to produce outcomes and to produce policies. And I think this speaks to me a lot about the way the Western ideas of outcomes and metaphors that we take from production, right? So we take, the metaphors from manufacturing, and we have outcomes and results and all of these things, where as I'm listening to you, what I hear is patience, timing, like the timing of when people can communicate to one another and when they're comfortable to communicate to one another, but just that there's this layering of trauma that isn't the same in each generation, but yet is being transmitted generationally, but with the unresolved part, right? And I know, I think it's just been shocking for Canada to see all of the babies, the young children, and you know, the bodies that are being discovered now. And yet I know that this isn't a surprise to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in the country. This was talked about back in the 1990s when the Royal Commission. So it's not a surprise to the Indigenous peoples, but I think your presentation puts that into context in terms of that unresolved piece, you know, and we certainly see with some of my colleagues who are residential school survivors, this, even though they knew the bodies were there, that it's like we're right back into those early days of talking about the residential schools and the rawness, how raw people were, and how, you know, difficult it was for people to talk about their experiences. And we seem right now in Canada to be back almost in that context again, you know.
Yes. I'll just add that the forced repression that people encountered when they were looking, when parents and grandparents were looking for information where their kids or grandkids were. I remember a grandfather told me I snowshoed for 3 days, and I get to that hospital, and the only thing they gave me is sort of a metal box, and it was impossible to open. And then they told me, you can go now. In other examples, it comes from justice, like police threatening the families, asking for information, what happened. So the intensity of the repression of you know, acknowledging the facts and getting justice, people back then were threatened and forced to silence, and very thick silence, to protect the younger ones, because that the threat was that way. So this in itself, the repression of the memory, almost, it's like forced amnesia, has its own journey through generations. And it's not easy to undo that, because there's so much related to, so much weight to add pressure on this. So that's the other aspect, I think.
I think Tara has a question. I see her hand up.
Yep.
Hello.
I'm really, really enjoying your presentation. Thank you very much for it. My question is, so as you're working with the people in the younger generations, and they're kind of coming to their understanding of what's driving their actions, or what's going on, like how the intergenerational trauma is going. So, and in this last example, say of the father who was able to establish some healthy boundaries for his second son, do you find that that helps the older generation? Like, what happens to the grandmother in this scenario? Does she find some understanding and healing, and is she able to express and I don't know, her original laws? Does that change anything for her, I guess? Because it changes things for the younger generations, but is it changing anything for the older? That's my question.
And you may need to unmute yourself again. I just heard a bit of an echo with Tara, so I muted you, Dr. DeArgon. Hopefully you can unmute yourself. I'm just going to click the ask to unmute button. I can't hear you still. Hold on. I'm going to make you a co-host, and then hopefully that'll work. My apologies. Do you get a notification to unmute? can't hear you right now.
Is it okay now?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, thanks. I got a powerful example, and we won't have to go through it. But it started with two community members committing, two young ones committing suicide a month apart. We go there, and my colleague, my Innu colleague, is from that community, which helped us. And they really wanted help to grieve, from the suicide of their sons. And so we gathered both families. They wanted to do that work together in the evening. So we gathered both families, and we started to go back in history. And at one point, when we got closer to that event, and maybe we can go to another more, the other one. Yes, yeah, the last one. Just the one before. Yes, thank you. So these two at the bottom, you can see the two red squares, those two best friends who committed suicide a month apart. And both families, again, asked for some help. And so we ended up exploring on each side. It was so tense and so powerful at the same time. And eventually, one of the grandmothers, I think it's the red circle there, when the grandmother stood up, and she got so angry at me, thinking I was the devil or something, and because I was leading the discussion, let's say. And she was rageful. We can't talk about this. We can't talk about this. And her own son, who has lost his son to suicide, stood up, and he said, "Mom, it's time. We need to know where we come from. We need to know what happened." So everybody, half of after almost everybody was crying and emotional. And then both grandmothers, one had lost a brother, and the other one, yeah, I think both of them lost a brother, and then the brother were fishing together, and they were drowned by that big company there. That there was it's an incredible story, but they would play with Innu people. They would kill them in so many other ways also. But one of the ways was to circle them with big boats, and they didn't know how to swim, so they were drowned together, And then they would go look for help to police, and the police threatened them. If you don't shut your mouth, something else might happen, and something might happen to your children and grandchildren. So that's what I meant with that powerful pressure to keep silence. And in that situation, that grandmother was rageful when she realized that opening up today, that there was no risk of anybody dying from it. And when it brought closeness in her family, the younger ones would take care of her. And then she realized that talking about this stuff now would protect the younger ones in the family. And so in a way, she became a champion among elders and trying to support them so they could open up today more with that. So it was incredible to see that the pressure that she had from police back then, the very tight pressure and life-threatening pressure, was still there inside of her 3 generations later. So unfortunately, it took the sacrifice of the younger ones, the the two boys. We cannot help but comparing their loss to what happened to in that other generation. So that's a very powerful question. It depends. But when we can protect life and not and still help elders to understand what is, it's a very tough thing. And here in that situation, it took the young boys, the young boy's father, the son of that grandmother, who stood up very, very strongly and said, "Mom, it's time to open up." And all that changed her a lot. Again, she was happy. Her granddaughters would come to her, talk to her, and then she could be close to them. And that's what she was sharing with other elders. I don't know if we still have time. Allison, do we have time for another one or not?
Well, and Normand, I want to add in, I think for everybody, in the context of which you have worked, the resource extraction industry, so mining and all of that in these northern communities,
Right.
has been a source of trauma that, we talk about residential schools and we talk about the 60s scoop, but there has yet to be a national conversation on what the extraction industry has done and did before there was lots of policing and before there was lots of attention to them going into the north and for resources. And I think that's one of the things that your research in northern Quebec has been so important pointing out.
I could share much more of in that, on that side. Incredible stories, but you're totally right.
Just around time, we don't have another event starting until 3 o'clock. I do know, like, people may have blocked this time off in their calendar. So if you do have to leave, we understand, but we do have time to continue the conversation. So I would say you're welcome to continue, and if people have questions, to continue asking them, and then just let me know when you'd like me to stop the recording, and we can open it up a little bit more broadly too.
Thank you. I'll share another example in that line, in a way, and that would be the slide just before this one. Oh, ugly. So this is a community where I've been doing some work for maybe 25 years, and walking with the community, and so attached to that community, and deeply emotionally involved also. I'll tell the story the way it happened. I was invited to come to the community to offer workshops for the workers, the community workers, on how to use genogram in that way. Because they caught up as a tool, and they were then quite religious, so they were not ready to move to cultural ways of healing yet. That. And again, I think that was kind of a bridge for them, this kind of intervention. Just a second, I think I need some water. So I was driving to that community, and there's the last part is like 3 hours bush roads, and I crossed the ambulance, going fast to the next city. I said, okay, what happened? So I arrived in the community, and they tell me we just had a suicide attempt, and we're not sure if we want to have that workshop today because people are all emotional, and we don't know if they'll feel available. But something new is that that girl's grandmother, who raised that granddaughter, would accept to see you. And that was a first because she never wanted to see me before. And there was 4 other suicides, like one of her child and 3 grandchildren in the past. And so that granddaughter who attempted suicide, she came and told me, this one I don't want to lose. So I accepted to see you, while before I would run away from the community where I knew he was coming. So I said, I'm really happy that we can talk. And I offered her, if those workers who were supposed to have training that day, if we could have a conversation, like a circle involving them, and then giving her the choice if she would like to invite other people, other elders or family members. And she said yes. So finally we ended up with a significant circle, including chief. And we started, I asked the community, the young community workers, to ask her questions in their language, and the kind of question that they would have, because she had lost already a son and 2 granddaughters and a grandson. And before today, and it's today that, you know, she reacted a different way. I don't want to lose this one. So after a whole day of looking at her own history and seeing the young ones asking questions to their elder, and they were all afraid of her because she was known like a witch, you know, eating up her grandchildren. People would say that her own daughters had children just to give to their mom, for her to eat them up or destroy them. So that wasn't funny at all. And that was a big uh, piece for the whole community. So through that gentle circle, the younger ones, the young workers, really caring, not blaming, but caring for her, and asking her, what happened? What happened to you? And again, people in the community would see her like a witch, considering all the losses that happened under her. So she opened up to a very, very incredible community wounding in the past. And she said that her parents had lost the 4 older children, and that she was the 5th one. They had lost them because they had to send them either to hospital or residential school, but none of them came back. And this was happening in the whole community. But in her situation, when the mother was pregnant with that grandmother, who was the youngest in her family, the parents decided that they would hide her in the bush, so anybody could not, you know, steal her like they had done with the others. A lot of people were saying even when they were not sick, we were forced to send them to hospitals, and they wouldn't be back. So she was protected by her parents, but in a way, the kind of role she had filled her up with so much wounding. She became a replacement child for the 4 other ones who never came back. And so you start your life by replacing more or less 4 dead ones. And that those losses were never resolved. So it's a very complicated role, and sometimes we label it as a replacement child syndrome. when parents will use one child to carry the ones that were lost before. And at times it can become, it can become, this child is so important for us and we love you. But other times the child ends up being blamed to be a survivor because we lost the other ones. It's very complicated, it's very tricky. But we were not able to deny that most probably the 4 first losses by suicide that she let happen were related to that role. And in a way, she was externalizing the death, the 4 death that her parents, in a way, asked her to carry for them so they wouldn't feel that loss that painfully. So it took the suicide attempt of a 5th granddaughter, and she was 5th child herself. It took her attempt to wake her up so she could say, this one I don't want, because I guess she identified to that granddaughter. It would have been the 5th loss. And like her parents said, after 4 losses, this one will protect her. We don't want to lose her. She said more or less the same when her granddaughter attempted suicide. And through that process of bringing younger generations, different generations, elders together in that situation where we were supposed to have a workshop, we couldn't believe the outcome because the younger ones started to visit her and people started to open up about that period where there's another issue of water being poisoned by logging or something like that. And a lot of kids did become sick. So the whole community was depressed and discouraged. But since then, and thanks to the 5th one who attempted and not completed suicide, gave her a chance, but then also the circle, the younger generations and the elders together were able to transform that trauma into healing. And it's going on. So that's another situation where I learned so much. And if you have any comments or questions, please. We're using a bit extra time there. I'm sorry, I get emotional too, and I'm hard to stop.
I'll also say if people feel more comfortable putting their questions in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. I'm keeping an eye on it.
So I think too, I mean, in the context that all of this was happening in those older generations, there was a lot of change that was happening quickly, wasn't there, in terms of like, as you say, logging and other types of industries that were coming into places where there weren't non-Indigenous people coming in, I think. And so the changes that were happening and the ways in which people, communities or groups of people, their first interaction with those industries was generally not positive. And I know we've seen Manitoba Hydro reports on women being raped, and I know you've told about communities when I think in one case men were being hunted, and and so that there was a lot that was happening, and I think a lot of silence. It seems to be a lot of silence around it because there weren't police necessarily there that were doing anything.
And sometimes police would add to the silence, right? With threat.
Mhm. Mhm. And I really do feel that, there's a reckoning that will happen, I think. It was prior to COVID, there was starting to be movement, um, where there was a lot more attention after the 60 scoop settlement, and just before COVID, where there was a lot more attention being paid to the extraction industry, which in many ways has never been held accountable for the impacts in communities. So while we focused a lot on the residential schools, those impacts of the extraction industry have been enormous, and always that the extraction industry in the north is always serving the south, and it's not serving. And I think there's that wonderful crazy picture in Quebec of Hydro-Quebec and this great big towers, and then this wee little house, this little shack of a house at the base of one of these big towers that does not have electricity, right? And it's a very famous image in Quebec, depicting the fact that all of this is happening on Indigenous lands, and the Indigenous people themselves do not have the services of those industries, does not have the benefit of those industries.
Totally right.
Oh, I think James has his hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to also add, Carolyn, to your statement. I think environmental impacts, and particularly that eco analysis, I think that only Indigenous peoples can provide, is so critical today. And just as much there's psychological harms to families, our relations also include Mother Earth. It includes the land and the waters. I'm thinking of the water walkers and some of the work they're doing and leading in terms of healing. And also too, there are projects out there, who so rightly point out the extraction industries. But in Saskatchewan, for example, Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting, they erected dams in northern Saskatchewan that benefited the Hudson, the mining industry in Flin Flon, and they were erected, and authorizations were given even before Saskatchewan had decision-making power. It was by the federal government in 1929 and 1930. And these issues are still current today. And the role of police is very interesting. I'm not trying to be police bashing. I have a brother who's a member of the Regina Police Service, and they do a very difficult job. But I know that the camps, particularly in BC, among the Wet'suwet'en and Gitxaalen people, protesting pipelines, have been subject to tremendous coercion and violence at the hands of police and the justice system. So the trauma and the intergenerational trauma linked to settlement and the demands of resource extraction industries is something that is huge. And the story of dispossession of people in terms of culture and language is also the dispossession of land, the dislocation physically of people from their traditional lands. Anyway, just a comment.
Thank you.
So I guess my other question is how do you see this fitting into, when we look at the complexity, this is very different than what we see in terms of, say, youth suicide strategies, right? So we see a lot of the youth suicide strategies focusing on the youth and focusing only on the youth. And there's very limited attention to the complexities that you are describing. And so how do you feel that we could or what is the direction that we should be taking? You know, as you know, here you have a group of researchers who work with you know, community-based research, and you know, how does this fit with again that drive by Western medicine and Western society and Western governments to quickly solve the problem and to come up with neatly packaged solutions, which you and I have been doing this, you know, I mean, you know, back from the days of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is now, you know, a few decades ago, and the issues haven't changed, or the outcomes haven't changed, or the numbers haven't changed. We still have high rates of youth suicide. And so we know that our approach to it is not really working. And I think the reason why I enjoy, you know, it's stimulating listening to what you're saying is that I really feel in some of the work, you know, with Lawrence Kiermaier and others, that we may be missing the complexity altogether.
It's another great question, so important, because we see in a couple of examples that it took the sacrifice of younger people to open up and bring elders to come up with the truth, the facts. And then when the facts are open after having been buried for generations, there is a new energy being unlocked. There's no magic there. And again, all the consequences of intergenerational transmission of trauma involving a lot of internalization. You know, like the bad is not only out there, the bad was moved to some family members, or, you know, so even that granddaughter as the fifth one, but it took the 4 sacrifices before that. The other community I was talking about, it took those 2 to like an electric shock. So my hope is that the acknowledgement that we see about children having been buried, and even if everybody knew, but it could not be acknowledged collectively, it could not be acknowledged in the dominant society. So I'm really hopeful that the impact of the fact that we have access now, nobody can question what. So I have fears because it is so complex in those families, you know. And again, all the negativity got inside the family functioning, and you know, as much as there's a complexity there. But my hope is that unearthing the truth of what happened will help the elders sharing with the younger generations what they went through. And that is a protective factor, a powerful protective factor. And we started to see young people in the, you know, demonstrating, or who feel connected with those kids who were lost back then. And so this is the hope that I have. But I think every generation will have its own challenges in there. But I think the youth might take the leadership. That's how I feel. And especially when they realize they've been carrying this stuff, this unresolved stuff inside themselves, and making their life harder and darker.
I see
Tina.
Tina, yeah.
Yeah, I think Tina has a question.
Hi, Tina.
Hi, Dr. Argon. Thanks for the great presentation. It's kind of odd that we're talking about this right now, because as we speak, we're dealing with this in my traditional homelands right now. Um, there has been so much work, and we have a gold mine, we have logging, they've logged right around us. There's just a little piece of territory, a little piece of, I'm not sure how many hectares are left of wood that they're after. And considering all the work they've done all the work all around us. And, you know, they have to have like the meaningful consultation that should have taken place so long ago. And I've been away from for school for a very long time, and I come home and I see this, and now, you know, I told them, you know, that we have grave sites here in my grandfather's territory that we need to be careful, right? And then everybody scrambled because, you know, this, they've already done all the work, and they have done the meaningful consultation is not there. And so then it leads back to the responsibility of the community leaders, the chief and council, right? I mean, why weren't they on board? Why did they not have knowledge of this stuff? And, you know, there's the revenue sharing agreement. It's very complex, like you said, and yeah, and so they've had this revenue sharing agreement for a very long time. And for me and my family, my family, as you say, have been like displaced like many other communities across the country here. A lot of my family members are living in tents, and you know, and it's taken, you know, my voice to speak out, and as uncomfortable as it has been, because I am related to like a lot of the people in the chief and council, right? So it's very uncomfortable to go out and speak. And you know, there is suicide, like very visible suicide, um, that you are talking about, you know, people hang themselves, but in our communities, it's slow death, it's death by alcohol and drugs. So yeah, so it's I really appreciate your presentation, and um yeah, it's definitely something to talk about at the community level, and for us, we depend a lot on our chief and council, our leadership to guide us. But at the same time, we've been silenced. We trusted them to take care of the territories, but it's not happening because, as you know, Indigenous people have a deep connection to their own traditional territories. Where I was raised, I have no concern of anybody else's territory. I'm connected by blood to my territory, my grandfather's trap line. So for me, I'm moved by it, and it causes trauma. It is trauma, like you said. You know, the first time I found out they were logging and that they were mining, it was like reliving the residential school all over again, because you had no control. You had no control of what was happening to your land, right? So yeah, so yes, thank you. That was a great presentation. I think that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you so much. I'll just add that this last example in that community I visited, because of logging taken over and over and closer, I think they had to leave 3 cemeteries through time. And I went there, and you know, the remains were still there, and some, that was awful, but they've been starting to act on it. And in that community, they have the cemetery right in the middle of the community, like protecting, you know, their cemetery after having been forced to leave the other ones. Any other question or comment? Quiet.
There's a comment in the chat. I won't share it. I'll share it with you later because it's just to me directly. And then I think
We're still recording, Allison?
we're still recording. Would you like me to stop the recording?
If you feel it's timely, I'd be fine.
Okay. I'll share. I just got permission to share the comments. So Jenny says, thank you for the presentation. It's been so insightful and heartfelt. I agree. Our younger generation can continue with this work because they will be equipped with the maps and tools that leaders like yourself and others. They can take us that step further. It did take us years of colonization, will take years to overcome these historical traumas. Thank you again.
This comment.
Do you want me? I can move on to I think the last slide if you'd like.
Move on to,
There's this one. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share or if you'd like me to stop the recording.
well, it's pretty much known, and we already covered it, I think,
Okay.
in our dialogue. But I just put at the end, folks in Indian country wonder what took science so long to catch up with traditional native knowledge. I think that's a comment related to epigenetic, but I totally agree with that. And then we cannot not acknowledge that part. It's essential. So if you want to go to the next step.
I'll stop recording if that's okay.
Thank you.